Let's talk about connective tissue. Sounds like a kind of a vague term, right? Connective tissue, it's like, what could that possibly be? It really is sort of a catch-all term for the stuff that doesn't fit into skin, muscles, and nerves, or epithelium, I should say, muscles and nerves. It's because it's such a sort of broad, vague category, there's a lot of variation within this category and quite a number of different tissue types. They vary in how vascular they are, but they're basically all vascular for the most part. They're all vascular. They all have blood vessels. There's nerves that traverse them all. They are vascular and innervated. And they're characterized by an extracellular matrix embedded in ground substance. So just about all these connective tissues have some sort of cells that can be found. Some of them are resident cells. They live in that tissue permanently. Some of them have transient cells which come and go depending on what's going on. They have fibers, which is what collectively you're going to refer to as the matrix or the extracellular matrix. All these little ropes and strings that are going through here, all of those guys, those fibers make up the extracellular matrix. And the ground substance is all this pink goo that you find in between them. And it's like a thick, it really is close in consistency in real life from our perspective to water. But at a cellular level, water actually feels pretty thick. It's got extra proteoglycans and stuff to make it more thick and viscous a little bit than water. But at the cellular level, it's really quite firm. It feels like a quite thick goo. The three main fibers that you find in connective tissue are collagen, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. Collagen fibers are ropey and structural. These yellow strings that you see coming and going, these ropes, they're not branching, they just kind of come and go in strands, are collagen fibers. They tend to bundle up into ropes. And these are going to keep things anchored oftentimes to other things and provide real structural support and firmness and shape. So think about your skin. You have collagen in your skin, right? Or under your skin, more properly. And the derm is part of the skin. What happens when you get old? As you age? Your skin gets saggier, right? Wrinklier, saggier. When you're a baby, your skin's all nice and taut. It's sticking so nicely to all the bones and muscles and fat under your skin. And it all looks so lifted and nice. And then as time and gravity continue to take its toll on you, and as you age, you're less able to replace your collagen fibers. Your skin's going to start to succumb to gravity and sag and wrinkle a little bit. You're constantly building and breaking down collagen fibers as you get older, as you go through life. But the older you get, the less good you are at rebuilding stuff in general, and that includes your collagen. Elastic fibers are these thin, wispy blue guys. I'm just going to make this look extra thick just so you can see it really well. Those extra ones, those are thin, wispy, and stretchy. If you have a tissue that's going to need to stretch a lot, you're going to find a lot of elastic connective tissue. Your aorta is a classic example of a place that has a lot of elastic connective tissue, a lot of elastic fibers. So your heart beats, it pushes blood out of the heart. And it does this in a pulsatile way. You have this big thrust of blood, kaboom, 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 push of blood, push of blood, push of blood with every heartbeat. And every time your heart beats and pushes blood into the aorta, which is that big fat blood vessel, that artery that comes right off the heart, you have this surge in pressure against the walls of the aorta. If the aorta walls were rigid and had no give, they would tear the first time your heart beats. If it was just made loose enough so that that surge in pressure wouldn't tear it, then it would be so loose that blood wouldn't really get to be propelled in one direction. It would just sort of slosh back and forth from your heart. So what the aorta really needs to do is to be able to stretch every time your heart pushes a surge of blood through it and relax quickly back, snap quickly back into shape behind each surge of blood so that the blood can help move in one direction for the most part. That tissue around your aorta is elastic connective tissue. It's got all of your connective tissue with fibers has like a mix of these fibers in it, but is typically predominated by one of these types. And that elastic connective tissue around the aorta is predominantly elastic fibers. Reticular fibers are like these brown cross-hatching up here. They have a mesh-like, I'm just going to kind of draw this mesh-like and branchy appearance, and they form support. So particularly in places where you need to kind of form either a scaffolding along which a whole organ will be built, or you need to be able to support something against the force of gravity, like hold up the liver against your diaphragm so it doesn't just fall into your abdominal cavity, you're going to find a network of reticular connective tissue surrounding and particularly underneath that organ to help keep everything up. And a thing to keep in mind with reticular fibers is that usually the parenchymal tissue, the parenchymal cells, the cells that are really like a part of the organ and doing the organ stuff, are going to be embedded densely in here. So you'll find when we talk about how these things look like in lab, that your reticular connective tissue is a lot of fibers with a lot of very similar looking cells across the whole thing. Special cells that live in connective tissues that make fibers, that secrete these fibers, are called fibroblasts. And I can't fit that over there, so I'm going to do it over here. Why is it doing this? Okay, you know what? Where do I see the word fibroblast? I don't over here, naturally. Okay. Oh, here, fibroblast, right there. Cells that secrete fibers are fibroblasts. And again, the matrix can have cells. It might be resident cells, it might be transition or transitory cells. Depends on what connective tissue we're talking about. This varies quite wildly. Now, the ground substance, as we mentioned, is that liquid goo that everything else is kind of suspended in. What this is made of is interstitial fluid, which, as you recall, is derived from blood plasma and pretty similar to blood plasma, but it's made thick and sticky with a substance called proteoglycans. Proteo because it has proteins, glycans because it has sugary kind of stuff on it. Remember the sugar compounds that are sticking off the surface of cells that help anchor it to other stuff and help the immune system identify it for what it is? That had that same prefix in it, right? So you have interstitial fluid, which is basically blood plasma, mixed with a bunch of proteins and a bunch of sticky, sugary things that are secreted by fibroblasts. The proteoglycans are secreted by fibroblasts that make, at the cellular level, this liquid feel very thick and molasses-like, so that all of these fibers can be suspended and stay where they are in three-dimensional space. They don't fall against gravity. The liquid is thick enough to hold them all up and in place. Because they have so much of this sort of sugary component to them, it's a very effective humectant. Connective tissues hold on to and absorb water very, very well. This is important. If you lose your ground substance, your fibers can't really support themselves anymore. Your connective tissue is holding other stuff together, and it's not going to be able to do that job very well either, right? In addition, your connective tissue is a pretty important reservoir of water for your body that it can draw from in times of dehydration. The ground substance is also important because since it's basically a watery-based substance, nutrients and water-soluble compounds can dissolve through the ground substance. Now remember when we were talking about epithelium. Does epithelium have its own blood supply? No, epithelium is avascular, lacking blood vessels. The connective tissue immediately below that epithelium has lots of blood vessels, including dense capillary beds immediately deep to the epithelial layers. If ground substance could not dissolve things through it, this arrangement wouldn't work. This arrangement only works if stuff can dissolve out of the capillaries through the ground substance of the connective tissue and reach the epithelium, and vice versa. The epithelium is able to release its waste, secrete it down through the ground substance and back into the bloodstream. If ground substance wasn't able to do this, your epithelium would require its own blood supply embedded within it. Now let's go into different types of connective tissue. Again, we're going to focus on the roles and the functions of the connective tissues and only touch on how they look here in lecture. Lab is going to be all about visual identification. So connective tissue proper refers to all of the solid types of connective tissues. You'll find there's a liquid kind too. That can be divided into dense and loose connective tissue. Types of loose connective tissue include areolar, which is pretty disorganized. You've got all kinds of different fibers. You've got all kinds of different cells. You find it all over the place supporting and binding other tissues, and proportionately it's high in ground substance. So all these like open, empty places between fibery, celly looking things is where the light from the microscope can just pass through unobstructed because there's nothing solid there. It's just liquid ground substance. So lots of ground substance, no specialized cells of its own, no resident cells. The cells from other places like immune cells and stuff can just come and go as they need to, and lots of other different types of fibers. As a consequence, it looks like pure chaos on a slide. You can see you have these thick collagen fibers, you've got some elastic fibers, you've got some reticular fibers, you've got big cells, skinny cells, little cells. It's a whole mix, and there's a lot of white space. So that's going to imply to you areolar. You have areolar connective tissue, for example, immediately under your skins, up under your epidermis. The most superficial layer of your dermis is mostly areolar connective tissue. And because it's so loose, it can basically support a lot of blood vessels. It's not terribly dense, so you can fit more other stuff into it. Another type of connective tissue, loose connective tissue, is adipose tissue. You have two kinds of adipose tissue, and I'm going to even get rid of this word fat here because if you wrote fat on an exam, I would mark you down for that. You really need to say white adipose connective tissue and brown adipose connective tissue. Now, ordinarily for exams and practicals, I want you to write everything out. I want you to spell out epithelium, stratified, squamous, blah, blah, blah. Connective tissue, you can abbreviate to CT if you want to. So you have white adipose tissue and brown adipose tissue. I'm going to start with brown over here. Brown adipose tissue is tissue that holds on to fat. Adipose is fat. But it also is rich with blood vessels and it's rich with mitochondria. The individual cells are very rich in mitochondria. Any place where you're storing fat is going to be a good place to hold on to body heat. Thermoregulatory function. You pack on, if you're a whale that lives in the Arctic, you're going to pack on lots and lots and lots of fat to make sure that the heat you're making in your core doesn't just dissipate out into the cold Arctic seas. So brown adipose tissue has this fat content that helps you keep in fat, but it also, because it has all those mitochondria, helps you make heat. Brown adipose connective tissue is thermogenic. You make heat, and because you have all those fat cells or those fat globules floating around, you also hang on to your heat very well. And it's called brown connective tissue because when you stain it by traditional means, it takes on, the mitochondria picks up dye and the blood vessels pick up dye, and it has this like brownish rusty color to it. This slide makes it look more purplish, but typically that's not the case. Infants come with a fair bit of brown fat because they have such a hard time like regulating their own body temperature, so they kind of make a little extra heat. You lose this as you get into toddlerhood and childhood and adulthood. And by the time you're an adult, the only amount of brown fat that you really have is a teeny tiny amount under your collarbones, in your neck, and along your spine. You also find a fair bit of brown fat retained, though, in indigenous Arctic peoples, people who, over evolutionary time, have spent their whole lives as a population in very, very, very cold places. And so people who held on to their brown fat better were better able to reproduce, and then that kind of made it so that as a population, indigenous Arctic peoples tend to have more brown fat. White adipose tissue does have this thermoregulatory function. It helps you keep in your heat, but it doesn't make any of its own heat. And you can see a pretty stark difference between these two tissues, right? This one has a lot of stuff going on, and this one really doesn't. This one over here is basically just big, 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 big fat cells, beautiful fat yellow cells that are filled in here. Looks like empty space, but really that's just oil droplets, fat droplets being saved inside of the cell. So much so that its nucleus is pushed off to the side right under its plasma membrane. These cells are specialized to hold on to as much fat as humanly possible. And that's basically it. You consume glucose, you either use it or you don't. If you don't use it, your liver turns that into glycogen, which is where it takes all those simple sugars and assembles them into big branchy fat starch-like molecules called glycogen. And then if you don't if you don't use up your glycogen because you're keeping up and exceeding your daily calories, you're going to then your liver is going to convert that over into fat to be stored in these adipocytes. You have adipocytes like under your skin. You can feel that, you can pinch that, and that helps for padding and thermoregulation and excess energy storage as a shock absorber. You also have fat inside of your body, underneath your skeleton, around your organs directly. That's going to help as an energy storage for those sites, but mostly it's going to basically be a shock absorber and padding around these organs, so that as you move around, as you absorb impacts in your day-to-day life, your organs just aren't like destroyed every time something gets hit. And that's a really important feature, that you have fat all over your body to help protect things. It is nice and, as we all realize, it's nice and cushiony and can help absorb shocks pretty well. You only need a little bit on the inside of your body, though, and a little bit under your skin. Having too little adipose tissue on your body, like if you go into underweight BMIs, that gets really bad for you really fast. You don't have enough energy storage. You're not going to keep in very much of your own heat. You might have some organ damage associated with not having enough protection around your organs. Going over your regular BMI, whatever that happens to be for your height, is also detrimental to your health, but it creeps up more slowly. The problems creep up more slowly. Overweight is not good for you. It's not as bad as being slightly underweight, but it's still not good for you. It's harder on your joints. It's harder on your cardiovascular system. It's harder on your liver. It's harder on your kidneys. It's just sort of a little bit more for your body to be doing all the time. When you get past that and into stages of obesity, it becomes disproportionately worse for you the heavier you get. So it's a slower climb to really serious effects of your fat levels when you get more overweight than underweight, but that doesn't mean that it's not capable of being just as bad. It can have really serious systemic effects. Partly because of the simple mass that it takes up, the amount of heft you have to haul around with you every day, the amount of distance your blood has to travel to get places, the weight on your joints that it has, but also because one other thing that your white adipose tissue does is it makes estrogen. So when you have more adipose tissue, you can have, and an excess of adipose tissue, you can have an excess influence of estrogen on your body. At a population level, girls that have higher BMIs hit menarche, age of first period, sooner than girls with low BMIs. There's a whole host of other factors that go into that too, but this is a pretty decent correlation that we've established. Girls used to hit menarche in the 18th and 19th centuries and stuff in their like mid to late teens. We're talking like 14, 15, 16, 17. And now the average age of menarche is like 11 or 12. As a large function of our body masses going way, way, way up from what it used to be in the 18th and 19th century. Then we were worried about getting enough food and had to worry. It was a real factor that you might starve to death fairly quickly because there just wasn't enough food going around. Now that problem isn't as bad. We're a lot more, as a population, having problems with having too many calories available to us. Not necessarily as much nutrition, but certainly we have an abundance of calories in the world. And overweightness and obesity is a bigger population issue than the opposite in the United States, at least. If you see men who have packed on excess adipose tissue, you can also find that they take on some estrogenic types of traits like gynecomastia, which is where you have this sort of male breasts that form when you get past a certain amount of obesity. You can have a thinning of facial hair that sort of is a representative of a tweaking of the balance between the testosterone and estrogen that they make anyway. Women make testosterone and estrogen, men make testosterone and estrogen. It's just in men, the testosterone is a lot compared to the estrogen, and in women, the estrogen is a lot compared to the testosterone. But when you have a man who's very obese and has a lot of this white adipose tissue, which is making estrogen, that scale isn't quite as steeply tilted in testosterone's favor anymore. And so some of those features can level out a bit. Excess adipose tissue and the estrogenic effects are a major player in the development of PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, where it's heavily estrogen driven. So you can get PCOS without being obese, and that's usually pointing to some more serious imbalances that are harder to correct. But if you have enough extra adipose tissue on you that's making this estrogen, it can predispose you to developing PCOS. Unfortunately, one of the side effects of PCOS is that it slows down your metabolism. Not much, we're talking like 50 to 100 calories a day, tops. But it does slow down your metabolism, and if you're overeating enough or consuming enough calories over and beyond what you need in a given day to be overweight in the first place or obese, then that 50 to 100 calories a day is going to add up pretty quickly. It's going to have a major impact on how quickly you get even heavier, which then exacerbates your PCOS, which then makes it's this awful vicious cycle in there. But that can be very often adipose driven. Another type of connective tissue is reticular connective tissue. As I mentioned, you'll find bands of reticular fibers with a lot of the same sort of looking cells studded all over the place, because this type of fiber tends to form a supportive meshwork that's embedded amongst a series of cells that it's trying to support. So you find reticular fibers everywhere because you do need support and scaffolding structure for all of your tissues, but you find it a lot and much more abundantly in this specific type of reticular connective tissue. So you find it in lymph nodes, you find it making up as the scaffolding overwhelmingly for your spleen, you find it in your bone marrow, you find it holding up your liver and keeping it tacked up to the underside of your diaphragm. Think about where your liver is for a second. It's on your right side, it's under your diaphragm, and it is freaking huge. It takes up like a big fat chunk of your right side under your rib cage, like just on the bottom part of your rib cage. Take a look at a diagram of the body. It's compared to the other organs, it's gigantic. And therefore it's also heavy. Gravity is a thing everywhere in your body. And so in order to keep the liver tacked up against your diaphragm, despite being as big as it is, you need a good, solid, supportive meshwork to not only keep all those cells together, but also to keep it tacked up. And so on the bottom side in particular of the liver, you find a very thick kind of capsule of reticular connective tissue that helps keep it from falling on top of your other organs. So take a look here really quickly. I'll belabor this in lab, but you can see all these fibers coming and going. They branch a fair bit. You can only see some kind of going parallel. That's sort of an artifact of the fact that this is just cut in a little thin slice, so you're only really looking at it through one plane. And then all those cells on the slide, I mean, there's some variation in them, but they basically look the same. They're all about yay big. They're all pretty much the same amount of purpley. And there's not a lot of white stuff, not a lot of ground substance in this slide, is there? It's a lot of fibers and a lot of cells, and that's a good indicator that you're looking at reticular connective tissue. Dense connective tissue, so all those back there were loose connective tissues. Now we're talking about dense. You've got three main kinds. Elastic, we already touched on. Elastic is very stretchy in all directions. This is what surrounds your aorta, for example. And every time your heart pumps and sends that pulse of blood through your aorta, it needs to be able to stretch to accommodate it and then rebound back to its original size so that blood can be pushed into one direction. So when you find elastic fibers, they tend to be squiggly, and they're all going kind of tightly squiggly. It doesn't stain terribly darkly, and they're all going more or less in one direction in your slide. Because they're kind of wiggly, when this tissue stretches in that direction, this wiggly fiber flattens out. Also, since they're relatively short, you can afford to pull on them in either one of those directions too, and it'll tug the opposing tissues closer together. So this affords a lot of stretch in a lot of different directions. Very, very, very stretchy. Irregular connective tissue, take a look at that. You have fibers going all which way. You've got some kind of blue, 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 blue up here, and then off to the side, and then kind of around in this. And the pink bundles, which is what your collagen fibers are, these ropes that kind of makes it like here, and then another bundle here. Those are varying in size tremendously. A lot of them are pretty thick. There's some ground substance you can see. There's a handful of cells. But overall, it's overwhelmingly collagen, those ropes, sort of, and it's pretty disorganized. To me, it looks like if you took a nice smooth bed sheet and you grabbed a little bit in the middle and you shook it up, and then you took away your hand, and you'd see how there's sort of this wrinkliness all over, and now the fibers of your bed sheet are going all which way, and it's still one sheet, but it's a lot more disorganized than it once was. And it looks like a rumpled bed sheet under a slide to me too. You find irregular connective tissue all over the place. It's hard to say where you would find it because it's just everywhere. You find it in your dermis. You find it around your muscles. You find it in the surrounding connective tissues of your digestive tract. You find it in the surrounding tissues of your urinary tract. You find it making your meninges. You find it just all over the place. Dense irregular connective tissue, because you have fibers going all which way, can stretch a little bit in every direction, but only a little bit. It holds things in. It's got a lot of this structural protein, this collagen, so it holds things together really nicely. But it does have some give. It has a little bit of give. Dense regular connective tissue is very, very, very densely packed with collagen. And it has lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of fibroblasts to ensure that you can constantly be keeping this tissue super, super, super dense with collagen. Remember, fibroblasts are making collagen. So when you look at this slide, you usually have these long undulating waves of collagen all going in one direction. And these little spots are the nuclei of fibroblasts, and they're going all over the place. Or sorry, and you find them sprinkled all over the place, but they're still following these same lines of fibers that are all really, really, they're wavy, but they're all super parallel with one another. The elastic, you have tight little short-ish fibers with short little kinks to them, and they don't really line up super well. You can see how like this fiber doesn't exactly mirror this fiber, kinda, but not really, not enough to count. Here in the middle, it's very even. You find this tissue, therefore, in places where you want no real stretch perpendicular to the fibers, but you do want to have some give parallel to the fibers. Not a ton, because remember, collagen isn't super stretchy. It can be stretched a little bit because it's wavy, and so you can straighten out those fibers. But you want it to be strong you want it to be supportive, and you want it to have just a little bit of give. So you'll find that your muscles, so this is gonna be a terrible drawing, but like here is your leg. That's even worse than I thought it was gonna be. Okay, you've got your calf muscle right there, right? Gastrocnemius. And you have your Achilles tendon connecting it to the back of your heel, right? Surrounding this muscle belly, the actual like meat of the muscle, the red strapy contractile part of the muscle, that is surrounded by dense irregular connective tissue. When the muscle contracts, it's going to both shorten and get fatter, right? Just look at your bicep, for example, if you're having a hard time being convinced that it moves in multiple directions. Flex your arm, so you make a strong arm flexible, or flex your bicep, and you can see it shrink long ways and bulge out ways. So you have to encapsulate your muscle. You have to have some sort of a coating keeping it into itself, but it needs to be able to stretch multiple ways a little bit. It has to have some give. The tendon, you don't want that to get fatter or skinnier. You want it to stay super attached to both the muscle and the bone, but you do want to be able, like taking the Achilles tendon, you do want to be able to walk. You do want to be able to still move your foot around. So this type of tissue, dense, regular connective tissue, will allow for your heel to go up and down. But if you roll it side to side, your tendons and ligaments don't like that so much. They're not designed to stretch in those directions. So they get injured. But that's what that does. So we have elastic, which is super kinky, tight, wavy, and stretches a lot in a lot of directions. Dense, irregular connective tissue, which has thick, ropey, strong collagen bundles, but they're going all which way. It has some give, but not a ton. And dense, regular connective tissue, which is super dense with collagen. It's all wavy in a super parallel direction, and it has a little bit of give in only one direction. Cartilage is also a type of connective tissue. In this case, you have basically a capsule of ground substance. So if you think about where you find cartilage, you find it at like the ends of your bones, right? Is what you typically think of. So here's cartoony end of your bone. You have a cap of cartilage over it so that when the other bone meets up with it, you don't have bone rubbing on bone. You have cartilage rubbing on cartilage. But this right here, that articular cartilage, as it's called, has an outer capsule of dense, irregular connective tissue. That's one of those cajillion places you find dense, irregular connective tissue. And the inside is your cartilage tissue. Cartilage is avascular. There's no blood vessels in cartilage. A visual feature is chondrocytes, cartilage cells, chondro, cartilage, site cells, in lacunae. You see here is a cartilage cell, and then here is like this lagoon it's sitting in. Lacunae is that sort of surrounding bubble that it seems to be sitting in. I think lacunae sounds like lagoon, so it's floating in its own little lagoon. There's three types of cartilage: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage, from left to right. Hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage looks super silky smooth, except it's studded with these beautiful chondrocytes. You've got few visible fibers. You actually have a lot of fibers, collagen fibers, but they don't tend to be bundled as thickly as we're used to seeing, and they're very evenly dispersed throughout the connective tissue, throughout the cartilage, so that when you stain it and these collagen fibers pick up the dye from your staining, when you're trying to look at it under a microscope, it looks very even. It looks very smooth and evenly dyed. This is Hands down, far and away, the most abundant kind of cartilage in your body. If I ask you what kind of cartilage something is and you don't have a clue, just say hyaline. You've got like an 80% chance of being right. It's your default answer. You find it as your xiphoid process on your sternum. You find it at the ends of your bones. If you feel your nose, like put your forefinger and your thumb right up between your eyes, right? And you wiggle it back and forth, and there's no give. That's part of your skull. Now go down a little bit, wiggle, and you still don't have any give. Go down a little bit, and you have wiggle, but there's like a flexible rod under your nose, really close to the top. That's your cartilage. That's your hyaline cartilage that you're feeling. The very tip of your nose is all just like fat and skin, but close up to the skull, that's hyaline cartilage. It's the best place for you to experience hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage has way more visible fibers. You have those thin, wispy, elastic fibers we were talking about, but a ton of them. They're very densely packed, and so they look like these dark, branchy, fat ropes. And these guys in here are your cartilage cells, your chondrocytes. Very, very, very abundant in elastin. The main places you find them are in your ear, so the top of your ear, not your earlobe so much, where you have most people most commonly have a piercing, but like the top part of your ear, the pinna, and in your epiglottis that covers your trachea when you swallow so that food doesn't go down into your lungs. Fibrocartilage, you'll see these chondrocytes here in tidy little rows. There are fibroblasts, but they're hard to distinguish from the chondrocytes. And those have very fat, regular layers. Look how thick those are. And they're parallel layers of collagen. There's a little bit of waviness to them, but not much. Nothing's perfectly straight in biology. They're very, 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 very tough. They are made to withstand a lot of force and a lot of impact. You find this in two main places. You find it in the intervertebral discs. So you have your, I can't draw. I'm so sorry, guys. I should take an art class. Here's two vertebrae stacked up on top of each other, and you have a disc in between there. So that whenever you take a step and your whole body kind of goes up and down, you have this bouncing force. Your two vertebrae don't just bump into each other and rub up against each other. Instead, this fibrocartilage pad will absorb a great deal of that force. Actually, three main places. You find it there in between your vertebrae and your intervertebral discs. You find it in your pubic symphysis, which is the band of cartilage that holds the two sides of your pelvis together in the front. This is what, if you've ever been pregnant or known somebody who was pregnant towards the end of their pregnancy, they'll complain about that hurting a lot sometimes because that loosens up a lot right before you have your baby so that your baby can get out. And you also have it in the meniscus of your knee. So the lower down in your body you go, the more weight and the more force each joint is going to have to withstand with every step. So your through the whole length of your spine, you have this fibrocartilage. In between your pubic bones, you have this little small band of fibrocartilage, and your knees absorb a ton of force. And you find fibrocartilage there in the meniscus. Bone, interestingly, is a connective tissue. You can think of that as connecting all of your different muscle tissues together and providing the ultimate structural foundation for your body. Collagen is forming the structural foundation of all the other collagen tissues. Bone is providing the scaffolding for the whole rest of your body on a macro scale. Two main types of bone, compact and spongy bone. Compact bone is characterized by this tree ring-like appearance with basically no ground substance visible. And the cells that you see like here, 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 those are called osteocytes. The concentric rings all surround a central canal. This is where you'd have like blood vessels and stuff coming and going to feed these tissues. And all through here, you've got a ton of collagen. These osteocytes are secreting a ton of collagen. You also have bone cells that are laying down a bunch of this crystal. It's like a calcium-based crystal. That's why you need calcium for your bones, is because they're going to use it to build your bones. Calcium is chalk, basically. It's super, super, super rigid, but it's brittle. Collagen is strong, but it's super flexible. This super rigid, fragile stuff mixed with a flexible substrate of collagen makes your bones really strong, but has just enough give so that every time you take a step, you don't break a bunch of bones. But it takes on this concentric ring appearance around a central canal, and they're all nestled right up to each other. Way more often than not, the slide is stained in this sort of brownish color, but that's not a universal rule. Cancellous bone, you're only going to be able to appreciate in a more zoomed out view. Instead of having your cells laying down your bone cells laying down these concentric rings, instead they're going to form these like bridges between areas of bone. So it takes on, like look at that, it looks like a sponge, right? This forms the interior, like the lining of the medullary cavity of bones where you find marrow. So like the inside of there, the inside of the ends of your long bones are made up of this cancellous or spongy. I just go with spongy. You can say cancellous if you want. You should know that that's an alternate term. I only ever really use spongy though. And in between these holes is where you'll find bone marrow. So it's nestled in amongst those holes of the sponge. Finally, we have liquid connective tissue. This is unique in that there is no fibrous content whatsoever. There's no fibers in your blood, not unless you have platelets laying stuff down, and there's no fibers in your lymphatic fluid. In your blood, you have four main types of cells. You have erythrocytes, which are these guys. They're your red blood cells. They have this sort of donut appearance with a lighter colored middle, like a translucent middle compared to the outside. It's because they have no nucleus and they're way thinner on the inside than the outside ring. You have leukocytes, which are like these guys. You can see a clear nucleus, and they might be kind of speckled. Those are your white blood cells. You have platelets, which are these tiny little guys. They're not actually even cells. They're fragments of cells. You have megakaryocytes that break up into tiny little pieces, and those pieces are platelets. And you have plasma, which is all the liquid, the white stuff in between the cells. The main job of this liquid connective tissue, particularly with the erythrocytes, is to transport oxygen from point A to point B. It also provides a buffer for pH changes in the body. It's a main liquid reservoir for the body. It will transport nutrients and wastes to their appropriate places in the body. White blood cells come and go from your bloodstream, those leukocytes that you'll typically see, and those will help fight infections along the way in the bloodstream. And platelets aid in clotting. Lymph is, as we mentioned before, a parallel system to your venous system, and this is a major highway for leukocytes, exclusively leukocytes, white blood cells. Your blood will house white blood cells and help them travel, but it'll do a bunch of stuff, other stuff too. The lymphatic system is just for fluid and white blood cells. It carries interstitial fluid between cells in the bloodstream, and this doesn't have its own pump. Your skeletal muscular pump, as they call it, is what helps move lymphatic fluid around your body. So your heart pushes blood out of it and through your body, right? At least as far as your capillaries. Coming back from your capillaries, you have venous blood, the sort of oxygen depleted blood that has to get back to your heart. And you have lymphatic vessels too. And by the time your blood gets past the capillaries, that oomph of the pulsing of your heart, you don't really have that anymore. That's sort of smoothed out as through the super narrow capillaries. So you need to be able to help pump it back up towards your heart. And your veins in your lymphatic system have these valves that keep things from backflowing. But what's really helping them move around is the contraction and relaxation of your muscles and of your thoracic cage, the expansion and contraction of your lungs, which can change the pressure around your body to help pull blood in towards your thoracic cavity or not. And the movement, the thickening and shortening of your, and the lengthening and relaxing of your muscles can help massage all that blood and lymphatic fluid back up to your heart. In this way, movement is really the key to help keep you from accumulating fluid in your lower extremities. You ever notice when you fly and you sit there for like 8 hours and you don't move, your feet get big? You get up and move around and suddenly they're not anymore. You're using your skeletal muscular pump to pull blood back up to your heart. That's essential for both your veins and your lymphatic vessels.